Okay, hey API fans, and welcome to another LiveCast with Nordic APIs, hour-long sessions where we bring in industry experts to give us their personal take on niche API-related subjects. I'm Bill Doerrfeld, Editor-in-Chief for Nordic APIs, and I'll be your host today as we dig into what it means to craft usable APIs that developers actually want to consume. Today, we'll be focusing on the topic of usability and highlighting the ways in which we can design great developer experiences in our APIs. In this livecast, I have with me Abhinav Asthana, CEO and founder of Postman. He'll be outlining the key elements in how to make working with APIs faster, easier, and better, because APIs don't have to suck, and I couldn't agree more. Up, we're happy to feature Fokke Zandbergen, aka the Fox, support engineer at Zapier. And in his talk, he's going to go over some practical developer experience do's and don'ts, empowered by knowledge, integrating 1,000 APIs. So I'm really excited to feature these two speakers. We're trying to keep things within an hour, but after each session, we'll provide time for a 5-minute Q&A session. So if you're a viewer and you do have a question, just jot it down in the accompanying message queue for this video, and our team is standing by to deliver them to the presenters at talks. So first off, I like to begin with a brief introduction on what we're all about here at Nordic APIs for those of you who might be new to us. We are an international community of API practitioners and enthusiasts. We hold quality events all over the world. We run a high impact blog and routinely publish API ebooks as well. And since we formed in 2013, Nordic APIs has grown into one of only a few all-related API event series. It's the Nordic's largest international community for API practitioners and enthusiasts. And through the global reach of our blog, we're now connected to tens of thousands of API practitioners from all over the world. So our mission statement with all of this is to help companies make smarter tech decisions using APIs, and also to inspire better API-related solutions. We're pretty excited for 2013. We've got a lot going. 2018, we've got a lot going on. Our next event is going to be March 22nd in Copenhagen, the API Security for Banking and Financial Technology Conference. Next after that is going to be our second ever event in the United States with an event in Austin. And after that, we're doing our yearly platform summit in Stockholm. And this is one of our most, we have a lot of pride around this event. We're getting around 400 attendees. It's going to be a global universal API conference. Very excited for that. If you haven't already, check out the Nordic APIs newsletter. It's a bi-weekly digest of critical API insights that I put together. It's basically an overview of all the content that we've published. I think it's helpful. Hope you like it. Next up, with our ebook releases, we're working on a volume called Strategies for Microservices Architecture. So that's going to be our next release. If you're looking for something that's more related to what we discussed today, I recommend How to Successfully Market an API. I like to think of it as somewhat of a Bible for project managers that are evangelizing an API program. We talk about developer experience, how to improve developer portals, API best practices, discoverability for APIs, and much more. So bringing it back to today, why focus on usability? Well, I believe that usability affects all APIs, regardless of your provisioning status as private, partner, or public. Every API needs to be consumed in some format, and humans are still interacting with them. So having a quality developer experience is now essential and expected with any API strategy. And even though the industry stresses the importance of it, we could always use extra refinement. Since we can all relate, it's easy to share best practices on a subject from our own specific environments. And lastly, API usability combines both the business and technical components of providing an API platform, which are areas we strive to cover and balance at Nordic APIs. On the note of usability, it's really a core theme that our speakers routinely address at our conferences. As Ronnie Mitra of the API Academy said, if your API is poorly designed, poorly documented, and poorly supported, and they're not required to use it, you can bet they won't. And this only nails down how having quality developer experience is now really an expected aspect of providing an API in 2018. In my personal experience of researching and comparing APIs, I found that great usability is comprised of being able to quickly onboard a user. Some APIs even have a 5-minute integration guarantee, for example, which is really impressive to newcomers. Great usability obviously demonstrates a good technological and functional outcome. Otherwise, there would be no point in integrating. Great APIs have visible resources, often a very positive tone when addressing potential developer consumers. They're quick to adapt to new trends, scalable with your call demands, and they're really externally tested by the team, reliable, well-maintained, and supported by a very secure foundation of access management or identity control, or a combination of the both. In a blog post called 4 APIs Doing Developer Experience Well, we charted out 4 specific areas that we thought kind of described great API experiences. One being communicative, which we thought Heroku was doing well. 2 being interactive, where you can test sample calls and see the results. Marvel does that well. 3 was being guided, so having the support resources that really guides a user through the implementation process. An example of a company that does that well is Scale. And having a responsive API is very important as well. So check out that blog post if you're interested in learning some real-world examples of what we're talking about today. And I'm sure our presenters are going to dig into that as well. Lastly, in an article on optimizing the developer experiences for APIs, we kind of posited that in order to become a developer favorite API, you need to, 1, take care of redundant or repetitive tasks for developers. So you're alleviating their hiccups and allowing them to focus on their core elements. 2, you need to speak the language of developers, whether that be in your documentation or in the client libraries that you're using alongside your API. And 3, encouraging a hands-on approach, which is sandboxes, having that guided approach like I was discussing before really helps to achieve. So that's it on my kind of high-level introduction to what we're discussing today. So next up, I'm going to bring in Abhinav Asthana from Postman. I'm going to stop screen sharing for everyone here. There we go. All right. Abhinav, I'm going to give you the torch. How's it going over there?
Going great, Bill. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah,
it's great to be part of this webinar. I'm going to start the screen sharing and kind of take it from there.
Sounds great.
All right. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, thanks again, Bill. It's great to be part of this webinar. I've been a big fan of Nordic APIs. I've been following the blog over the past few years, actually, and have learned a lot in the process. And it has helped me a lot personally, while building Postman. So in this talk, I'm going to cover how you can make the developer experience of using APIs better, sharing some experiences of what we have learned here. And it actually kind of goes back to the origins of Postman itself. So just to kind of start the story a little bit from there, Postman started as a REST client in 2012. And the primary motivation for me to build Postman was because I did not like the experience of using curl. And in those times, APIs were fewer in number. They were built for simpler use cases, but the experience of using them was still kind of dependent on, okay, here is this curl call, go take it, run it, and try to integrate it with your code base. And I would fail a lot then. And that kind of prompted me to build something which was more interactive, more usable, and that's how kind of Postman came around. And in those times, kind of the notion was that you would build code first, and then you would think about integrating kind of later, and that led to a whole range of problems. So in 2012, around that time, Postman's interface reflected kind of all of these use cases. It was primarily a REST client, and the goal was to help developers send requests easily and get responses back, and help see a history of things. There were some authorization options, and I mean we saw a lot of good feedback. But from that point onwards, now in 2018, we see that APIs have exploded in functionality, and like every company is API driven in a way, and they write APIs first, and code kind of comes in later. And this is happening both internally with their infrastructures, with the growth of microservices, and externally. Stripe and Twilio, as you mentioned, are great examples. But we now see that every SaaS company wants to have an API out. They want developers to integrate closer to their infrastructure using APIs. So Postman in 2018 has actually grown as a product and as a community to kind of reflect this growth of APIs. We have now more than 4 million users across the globe. About half of them are monthly active users, and these users create more than 500,000 collections for all sorts of use cases in Postman, from documentation, mock servers, monitoring, all sorts of things that are now possible in Postman, in great quantities. So as a product itself, Postman has grown to become present across all operating systems. So we are available as desktop app on Mac, Windows, and Linux. We also provide cloud services, and we also have a really cool CI/CD integration tool called Newman, which you can run in a terminal. And we also have our own API. So not just that you use Postman with the features that we have, but you can also get your data out from Postman and integrate it as part of your API development workflow. So when we started Postman as a company, there were two things we observed in the wider ecosystem for APIs. The first observation was that the developer tools for building APIs don't talk to each other very well. You had to repeat yourself a lot when you would go from, let's say, designing to development, from development to testing, from testing to monitoring. And that had an impact on the people who were doing these activities, and they themselves were divided into silos, and they didn't talk to each other very well. So these were the two observations we saw, and this was true for even folks who were using Postman on a day-to-day basis. So we started the company to kind of solve this problem, and all the features that have come in Postman since that time have been geared towards kind of solving for these two observations. So at this point, Postman now supports every stage of API development. You can design your API in Postman and create mock servers for them. Of course, Postman has predominantly been a debugging tool, so we have a lot of additional tools on debugging now. We have a great automation testing framework built right into Postman, and that's the CI/CD integration that I was talking about. We also have great documentation capabilities. So with the click of a button, you can generate documentation for all the things that are there in Postman. And finally, if your APIs are being published externally, you can use us to publish and monitor your APIs. And all of this can be done in a collaborative environment where all sorts of different personas can come together, contribute to the development of an API together, and we see that as a fundamental advantage that comes while using something like Postman. So, of course, while we have been working on building Postman, we focus a lot on how do people create a great developer experience while both while building APIs and consuming APIs. And that's a question that we often go back to when we have to build new features or just understand how people are building APIs. So the first thing that we recommend now to teams who are API driven is you should streamline your API development process. There are lots of ways of doing that. I'll cover cover a few tips here. The first and foremost thing that we see having a lot of impact is having a great design for your API upfront, and not just using like an API specification or a static specification. We recommend creating mock servers for your APIs very early in the API lifecycle, and it has a whole range of advantages. The first thing it helps development teams do is it helps you parallelize your development process. So your backend team can work separately while the front-end team is writing code for the application. The backend team can write the implementation part. The QA team can still kind of work on the API a little bit. And instead of everybody having to kind of run to the specification or read documentation, you get a real tangible entity to play with, and you're much closer working to the tools that you're already kind of comfortable with. So everything kind of starts very early on, and that helps in solving a lot of problems that can come further down the road. So we strongly recommend kind of creating mock servers early on in your API lifecycle. The second thing on the streamlining part is just ensuring that you have clear error messages and kind of like these guides while somebody is debugging your API. So typically, a lot of internal error messages creep through into the final API, and as a developer, you would be spending a lot of time debugging APIs. You'd be switching back from your IDE or your text editor, writing some code, then coming back to something like Postman, trying out the API and seeing whether it works or not. And this is a very kind of rapid activity. It's kind of like developers don't even think about it. But if you don't have clear error messages and they run into an issue, that really kind of brings everything down to a halt. And a lot of time is kind of wasted in trying to find what the cause of the error is and where do I find documentation to fix it. And that's where you see kind of developers Googling just the entire error message, or going to Stack Overflow and asking questions. And you can avoid all of that by just instrumenting your API for error messages better. So in this screenshot, what I have is a blog post by this company called Chronify, and they really kind of took it to the next level by really having API responses that would help developers through the first few stages of integrating with their API. And I think they saw a lot of benefit, and the developers saw a lot of benefit out of that. So the third point on the streamlining part has been something that I guess everybody agrees upon, but very few people do, which is creating comprehensive documentation for internal APIs. So almost every team that we speak to has kind of like these documentation pages kind of buried somewhere, and a few people know about it, but not everybody knows where to find them. And slowly this cruft kind of accumulates, and eventually people just don't know whether documentation really exists or not. So we strongly recommend that you should have comprehensive documentation. You should start very early on, probably right at the point of designing your APIs, and making sure that there is a single source of truth for all your APIs. They should be easily findable, and they should be in constant use. And building comprehensive documentation is not like a one-time activity. As you go along through the API development process, you can keep enriching documentation, get more stakeholders in, and get their perspective. And that's how your internal API documentation can be a lot better. But if it's sitting somewhere and one person has a responsibility for it, then probably it's not going to be used. And now this is a feature that's unique to Postman, which is writing test scripts. And this is kind of stressing on the debugging point a little more, that instead of just having the API help in the debugging process or in the guiding process, in Postman, you can write test scripts that will run with every request. And Postman is going to give you that answer whether your tests passed or failed. So this really helps developers find out whether this flow that they are trying to execute is within the bounds of your system or not. And if they're doing something wrong, they get an error message which kind of would feel like it's coming from you. So this really helps them not kind of go around the go on the wrong path and get out of like error states quickly. Maybe there's something wrong with the request that they're trying to send. Maybe it's not designed for some kinds of data. So having just help right there in the form of test scripts also gives them more confidence while working with APIs. All right. So if your APIs are being published externally, we believe that you should put extra focus on it. This is, again, it's kind of agreed upon by the wider community, but what does it mean? So one of the interesting things that we have seen now by being done by a lot of external API publishers is not just presenting like a reference documentation, but they're also creating workflows for the use cases of an API. Now, what it helps you do is see things from the perspective of the developer who's integrating and using your API. And it helps them kind of picture in what context your API can be used, whether there are some common patterns that they can adapt. And maybe you have identified yourself that there are some patterns in which your API should be used. So giving them upfront these workflows would really accelerate their adoption a lot. And it it can be for simple use cases as well as for complicated use cases. If you have great external documentation, of course that's something that developers will love. I think you should spend extra effort on publishing documentation, making sure all the edge cases are covered. Just try to chart out your documentation as if it's a complete product, making sure all the information that you have internally from your API development process is represented in a legible form, in an understandable form externally as well. This will go a long way in making developers comfortable. And not just kind of talking about APIs, we also recommend that you should talk about policies, about your API, rate limits, very, very upfront. Like if you have a clear business model about your API, being upfront about what your API can be used for and what it can't be used for will help developers avoid surprises. And again, just use the API and have a great experience while building with that API. If you have an external API, you should of course be monitoring it. Postman has a monitoring feature to help you do that, and monitoring eliminates surprises for API consumers. Before they find an error themselves, using your monitoring service, you should diagnose these errors and fix them as quickly as possible. And with Postman, what you can do is you don't just monitor for status codes or response times, but kind of go the extra mile in monitoring for workflows and for use cases that your developers will actually be doing. So it should actually reflect kind of what rigorousness you would apply in your CI/CD pipeline, and you could do the same with your monitoring. The more comprehensive you are with monitoring your API, the less the surprises for your developers, and the better their experience will be. Now, since we have been building Postman, we have focused a lot on this problem of onboarding developers faster. And there are a lot of avenues now for companies to use Postman to their advantage to get their developer community onboarded faster. So one of the coolest things that's out there in Postman now is what we call the API network. So this aggregates a lot of APIs which you can now access through Postman. So this is also visible on our website. And what it does is it gives you access to API definitions with just a couple of clicks. So in Postman, a developer can just hit like the new button, go to the network, and search for the API that they're looking for, and just get a complete set of definitions which are ready to be played with in Postman. So it really helps with the journey. And instead of looking for documentation all over the place, you can use the API network to help developers much faster. If you have a developer portal already, you can use the Run in Postman button to help developers get your API specifications, documentation, or getting started guides that you have on the developer portal into Postman very quickly. So we have tried to kind of really work on the user experience here. You just click the Run in Postman button and select the app that you would want to get the API description or documentation in, and with just a couple of clicks, a developer will be ready to use that API in Postman. This is how Intuit uses it. We have a ton of examples out there where developers have integrated the Run in Postman button. And this is also a new feature that we're pretty excited about. This is called templates, and these are also accessible using the new button in Postman. And in Postman's world, what a template is, it's a combination of all the tools that are available in Postman, along with a Postman collection. So we have a few examples here which demonstrate end-to-end use cases of an API. Like you can check a website for broken links, you can audit your AWS infrastructure. And the idea here is that instead of just debugging individual request calls or using individual request calls, you can simulate end-to-end use cases of your API. So we are opening both the templates part and the API network part to external publishers soon. And in a few weeks, you'll be able to publish directly to both of these places. So summarizing what we have learned in our journey of building Postman, make sure you streamline your internal development process. Whatever you build internally reflects what you actually publish externally. Once you have your external APIs ready, put an extra focus on them, put an extra polish on them. And finally, you have a lot of tools available in Postman to help your community get onboarded faster. And that's all I had to share.
Great, thank you, Abhinav. That was awesome. I really love having you on this LiveCast because it's so relevant to Postman. I mean, the very foundation of creating your tool was based on creating more usable API experiences. I've been following Postman for a while. I've been a user and supporter, and I love that the extensions are platform agnostic. It's available across many different devices and different iterations. You have the web app, desktop app, stuff like that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, we are all for the developer experience.
Cool. I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet, but I jotted down some. I like how your talk was very comprehensive on a lot of different aspects of API experience, from designing great mock servers to using API error messages, creating extensive documentation, having a single source of truth, monitoring, a lot of the topics that we cover on the blog, which is it's cool to see you validate. Do you see any common anti-patterns existing out in the wild, though? Do you see something that's common that API providers are routinely not implementing correctly when it comes to developer experience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen is kind of using technologies as like a proxy for like automatically somehow magically like the developer experience is going to come together. One of the things that we have seen is like as a concrete example of that is the use or like rather misuse of API specifications at times. We when we talk to companies, they have specifications, and when we ask them, do you have documentation, they're like, yeah, we all have it. And what's happening is that that specification is actually being generated in a code base somewhere. It's lying on a server, and then it's somebody else's responsibility to go and find that specification and integrate that. And then that it's like a very kind of it's just what the perspective of the publisher is, rather than really taking the perspective of the consumer and just assuming that having a specification will automatically solve all of these problems. So I think just really stepping out from your shoes and really looking at the experience of the developer is not what a lot of companies are doing. And they say, yeah, developers use Swagger, so yeah, we have Swagger, right? But it doesn't really address the core problem.
Interesting. I also saw your API network release recently, which is great. Could be one way to solve the issue of not having a localized API directory or marketplace out there.
We are very excited about it, and there's been a lot of interest from the community overall, and both from small publishers as well as big publishers. I think we have PayPal there, we have Intuit there, and one of the things that we want in the API network is the API specification comes from the publisher directly. There have been a lot of marketplaces where people have aggregated APIs, but they often kind of fall out of date. And what we're trying to accomplish with the network is really bring publishers in direct contact with developers, right? So, and that's possible through Postman, not through like a proxy. And the proxy will, I mean proxy because there's a technical definition of proxy. I mean like a third-party marketplace where, if the definitions get out of date, the developers are going to lose trust in that marketplace and they're not going to go there. So with the API network, we're really hoping to kind of bring publishers to come together and talk to developers directly.
And do you see any specific APIs amongst the network like really doing developer experience well? Any specific ones coming to mind?
So I think we have seen a lot of good stuff coming out of Intuit and PayPal recently. These are more established companies, but they are really focusing a lot on the developer experience of their APIs. And I think they've done a great job of kind of they would be actually the examples of all the things that I mentioned. They have getting started guides. They have very comprehensive documentation, and I've even met some of the team members, and they're really pushing hard in improving the developer experience.
Well, thanks so much for sharing and being a part of the LiveCast, Abhinav. Yeah, we're gonna switch things over to Fokke right now. He's going to be presenting. So are you still there?
I'm still there, definitely.
Awesome. All right. This is your time to shine. I'm going to switch things over to you here. So go for it.
Good. Happy. Should be up. Alrighty. Can you all see that?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Okay. Thank you, Bill, for having me as well on the LiveCast. It was an interesting talk about Postman as well. I'm using that a lot, testing APIs as we come across issues that users report or that developers run into. And this talk is going to be using that same source of experience of supporting developers in integrating their own API or another app's API in Zapier. We now have over 1,000 apps connected to Zapier, which means that we've integrated with over 1,000 APIs and run into all different kinds of problems. So this deck is using a lot of lessons from those integrations. I'm not going to talk a lot about myself, but just to have some background on who I am. I'm a support engineer for Zapier, which means I resolve technical questions once and for all, hopefully. once for the user or the developer actually comes up with a question that support is not able to handle. And then for all, by filing a bug or maybe fixing it or suggesting improvements to our product managers. In that way, hopefully preventing the same questions from being raised again. Way more important is about Zapier. So before I tell you a bit more about what Zapier actually does, this is pretty much where we came from. We exist since September 2011 as an idea that Brian came up with, one of our founders. And a few months later, in May 2012, Zapier graduated from Y Combinator, and that was also the public launch for Zapier. Then a few months later, in September, we raised $1.3 million. And it was also the only funds we ever raised, because since May 2014, Zapier is profitable. We've been growing. 2 years later, we were at 1 million users and 10 million monthly or annual recurring revenue. I would hope it's someday going to be monthly, I hope. But at that time was annually. And just a year later, we were at 100 Sapiens or Zorbs. There's an internal discussion about how we call ourselves. I prefer Sapiens. And then just recently in January, we reached a milestone of having 1,000 apps integrated with Zapier. And at that point, we were at 35 million annual recurring revenue. So with all of that, what is it actually all about? Well, for a user, the magic is in chaining APIs with no code, or for their perspective, linking up apps without writing any code. So the core or the main place where they do that is in our editor, where they build workflows connecting different apps and different triggers and actions from these apps to build complex workflows that do kind of boring tasks that they can automate instead. And the editor or these workflows, SAPs as we call them, allow them to connect APIs that are not aware of each other and do not have direct integration with each other. But by simply mapping fields between the triggers and actions, they're able to create very complex workflows with no code at all. For an app or an API, it means that by integrating with Zapier, you actually integrate with over 1,000 other apps without having to do all of those 1,000 direct integrations. You simply define triggers, which are kind of like one-on-one with the GET requests of your API or webhooks if the API supports it. You define actions, which could be like the post request or put requests on your API. And with that, on the Zapier platform, you simply watch users build Zaps between your app and others and profit. And the profit is not in making any money directly on it, but by locking users into your app. We've seen that users that, for example, we send it in a use case with Typeform, that the users who actually use Zapier together with Typeform, the retention of those users was much higher than users that didn't, simply because they managed to integrate Typeform much more tightly into their workflows and other apps that they already use, that it's much harder to get to replace it with something else. So with that background, what I wanted to talk with you about today is the lessons from helping these developers integrate their API with Zapier. And I wanted to start with what I think is the most important lesson here, is to not reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of frameworks out there. There's a lot of standards out there. And the standards that we heavily optimize for are REST-JSON APIs that use OAuth 2 with refresh tokens. We also prefer REST hooks, and I'll come back to that later. And we love OpenAPI, or formerly Swagger documentation, or specification, I should say. And let's start with the last one. Documentation, as we also just heard, is not something to save on. It must exist. It must be complete. It must be versioned if your API is. I want to be able to dig up old documentation if I'm still on a previous version of the API. And it must be public. Never require developers to log in to see your API documentation. For developers, the specification and documentation, as well as tutorials and examples of an API, are marketing material. This is what they use to decide if they're going to use your API. And what we also see is that also for decision makers who have to choose between different apps, even if they're not technical, they'll strongly consider and they will consider an app that has a public API, public documentation, very clear information about that, above any other app, because they want to be able to use that app integrated with other apps that they already use. So having an API is certainly a pro there, and having a Zapier integration, of course, even more. And we strongly suggest to use a standard. So generate your reference from API Swagger files, and to just conform to that standard even more. Provide Postman collections or anything you can do to make it easier to use something that developers are already familiar with, so they can jump into it right away. And Zapier will support scaffolding integrations using OpenAPI soon, so that's even another reason to use that standard. Another lesson we've learned is that secret tokens are sacred. They should never expire. We're still running into a lot of APIs where all of a sudden the token stops working. Unless we have a refresh token, which then should never expire, or the user revokes it, it should not expire. It's a very common issue that we run into, and it has a lot of impact, because it means that, for example, with the workflows that the user create in Zapier, they all of a sudden they stop working and they miss out on tasks, and they have to do a lot of stuff manual again that they previously could do via Zapier or any other integration. So making sure that authentication works and continues to work is very important. Another common issue that we run into is getting huge responses from APIs. It's really important to make sure that the response is optimized. And you can do that by allowing the developer to specify a limit. Could either be like, I want to get the 100 most recent items, or maybe it could be based on time, like I want to see all the items since the last 24 hours. With that limit, of course, I still want to be able to get the full results, so you need pagination there. That can also be a page number, but that has a major downside that while I'm browsing these results, if there's new stuff, new items coming in, that means that depending on how I've sorted it, I'll either miss out on some of these results, or I get an overlap between pages. So what we see more and more often is a token, an ID, or any other, like the ID of the last result that you retrieved, and you can get the page for the next like 10 or 25 results from that ID on, making sure that you are browsing a fixed window within time. It's also very important for the response to include metadata. If I have no idea how many pages there are or how many results I have in total, pagination is not really worth a lot. Also, something to limit the data sent across is being able to filter and search data server side. I don't want to pull in the full results then to do searching and filtering on my side. I wanted the API to do that for me. And finally, one of the more advanced things here is to use field masks. Google does that on some of the APIs. And of course, GraphQL is especially excellent at this, but it's a little bit more complex to use. And at this moment, we don't have any built-in support at Zapier to do that, although it's perfectly possible to do that manually with some scripting. But being able to limit the fields that you get for each result also has a huge impact on the size of the responses that we get. Another something that's typically important for Zapier as well, since we trigger zaps on new items in most cases, it's very important for us that an API can be sorted in any direction on any field that we want. For us, the most optimal one is to have to sort on like the created add field, descending, so that the newest items are on the first page. But other developers can have other use cases. So ideally, you can sort on any field in any direction. And even better if I can sort on multiple combinations. The worst case that we run into is getting results that are sorted from old to new with pagination, but no metadata. This means that we have to browse through all the pages until we somehow run into an error notifying us that we reached the end, and then finally we know what new items there are. So sorting options for API, very important. But a lot of these issues actually can be resolved if you switch to REST hooks. REST hooks is a technique where we provide a unique URL or the consumer of the API, and instead of having to pull doing a GET request like every 5 or 15 minutes to see if there's anything new, the API actually calls that webhook whenever there is something new. The difference between REST hooks and static webhooks is that REST hooks, there is a technique where the API has endpoints to subscribe to these webhook URLs, where static webhooks, the user is responsible for taking that unique URL and going to the back end of the app and then manually configuring that webhook. And we've seen that REST hooks have up to 24% more of a higher activation rate than static webhooks, because it's just a lot more easier for users to handle. We've also seen that it can reduce the server load and traffic up to 66 times, simply because we don't have to pull all the time, but we only send data across the network, or the API does, when there's something to trigger on. And another benefit for the user is that this triggers zaps instantly, since we don't have to wait till the next poll, but we get called immediately when something new happens. And we actually saw this as such a big benefit for users that we started to require REST hooks for public apps. So I want to finish with some common practical things that we run into. Examples, I've used some actual copy-paste responses from our logs, anonymized some others to not embarrass any app here. But one thing what we still see a lot is not using HTTP status codes. They are definitely there for a reason. So an API should never respond with 200, then to, like in the JSON body, respond with the actual error and sometimes even the actual HTTP code. Use the HTTP status code. That's what API consumers will use to tell the category of an error. And surely, if you have additional details, put it in the body, but always use the corresponding HTTP status code. And the same goes for HTTP methods. We do see a lot of APIs that add stuff using a GET method instead of a POST. Again, for Zapier, integrating with Zapier, this means that you have to override the default request that we generate using scripting to change it from a POST to a GET and using the query string instead of a JSON body. So defaulting to the standards always saves you a lot of work and saves you a lot of confusing on the developer's part. Another thing that we think is similar and that we also run into is content type headers. If you say that you're sending JSON, make sure that you're sending JSON. A string is not valid JSON. It will not parse. We see this a lot with errors, that when everything is okay, you get a JSON body. As soon as there's an error, you get plain text or HTML. And when you do send HTML and also declare that in the content type, If the rest of your API responses uses JSON, so should your errors. Don't mix them up. And both issues come up a lot with APIs that share code or frameworks between the front end, the website, and the API. You really want to make sure that whether things is good or runs into an error, you get a response that an API should give and that a developer can actually work with. So we also have an engineering blog at Zapier where we talk a lot about the stuff that we run into implementing APIs and integrating with them. And if you want to know more about integrating your API or app with Zapier, you can go to zapier.com/developer. We have a web builder platform, which is more like a UI experience, but we also have a new CLI builder, which is offers some more opportunities there to be more flexible, reuse more code that you already have. So for developers, that provides an even better experience at integrating with Zapier. So with that, I'm open for questions.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Fokke. It was really nice to have you here. Likewise, very excited to have Zapier on a LiveCast. I mean, you guys are always really great at sharing best practices, engaging with the community, and it's always a pleasure to have Zapier at our events and such. It's really interesting to hear the history of Zapier, where you started. I've been a Zorp, as you say, for a while, or a Zapian. I'd rather be called a Zaptilian. Is that okay? So,
yeah, I think at the moment most stick with Zapians or Zapians,
okay.
And then Zorps is the runner-up. That's kind of how it is today. Yeah.
Cool. I'll just be like part of the minority then, the Zaptilians. Yeah, great. A lot of advanced knowledge though. Seriously, like keeping tokens secret and sacred, optimizing the response package with pagination and filtering. Actually, on that point, we did have a question coming in. Maybe you can address this. Pierre is wondering, could you elaborate on best practices for pagination? I think you glossed over this a bit, but if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, we actually are doing some refactoring at how we support that, because at the moment we don't, the integration with Zapier are they're not stateful, so they don't have any knowledge of previous requests that we did. So that makes it a lot harder to base pagination on a token or an ID, like the last ID fetched, or even on like the last time the request was made. And that's something that we definitely want to support, because we see a lot of APIs moving from regular page numbers to these token-based pagination, and it has a lot of advantages. So we definitely would suggest any API to go with that, and that's definitely the best way forward.
You think that's a new industry standard way?
Yeah, we see a lot of different implementations, so I haven't really noticed any de facto standard there, but yeah, that's definitely what a lot of APIs are moving into.
Cool, okay. We also had another question on Swagger UI, and yeah, so one user is asking, Swagger UI offers very poor developer experience out of the box. Any suggestions on improving developer experience while using OpenAPI spec? Maybe if you could start this, and then maybe if Abhinav wants to comment as well.
Well, I actually, I was wondering myself, if I have a Swagger API definition, can I somehow import that in Postman?
You can. That's what I was going to say next. Yeah, you can import Swagger spec file. I think version 1 and version 2 is directly importable in Postman. And actually, as we are speaking now, we're working on a converter. It's going to be an open source converter that we'll publish soon, which will run out of Postman. And it'll let you. So this is an interesting pipeline that we're building. Using the converter, you can integrate this with the Postman API, and then just have kind of collections, which is Postman's internal format, kind of come in directly. Okay, so one of the things that we were seeing in the community is that there are a lot of Swagger files floating around, and for a lot of cases, people want them in Postman. You can build a very clear pipeline, like, okay, the Swagger file gets converted, the Postman API is called, the thing appears in Postman on a regular basis. We're going to integrate the OpenAPI3 converter in Postman pretty soon, but that's a bit far away. For now, there is like this whole mechanism outside which will exist as an open source project from us pretty soon.
Do either of you see any developer experience improvements with the recent OpenAPI iterations in version 3.0? Just curious.
So, I mean, at least from our perspective, I think it's definitely like, a big evolution of the spec, right? There are the way I think about specifications is that, there are ways to think about an API kind of when you are, modeling them and when you're designing them. And this whole tooling aspect of, how it's consumed kind of comes in a little later. So I think there are a lot of improvements in OpenAPI 3 in the modeling part. I think tooling is catching up, and we are also, as I mentioned, we are doing our bit to get this integrated more and more with Postman. I think there is I don't have the link on the top of my head, but there was a place where I think the community was tracking OpenAPI3 tools. Maybe Fokke can maybe you have the link or something related to this.
Yeah,
I don't have that link, but yeah, I mean, the Swagger UI is all open source, so anybody who feels like it can use some help there to be more user-friendly can do a PR. Yeah.
So actually, one thing I'll highlight is that there's a fundamental problem I feel with this whole notion of like this try it button, which I think publishers should kind of understand that your API, and Zapier is actually a good example, that your API is not being used in isolation. It's being used along with several different APIs, and just focusing on okay, I generated my documentation page and it has a try it button. It's kind of like the first step in this process of using an API, and that is something I think a lot of tooling, a lot of folks just miss. That I do have tools for calling an API, but the API is not being called from. It's not just your API that the developer has to think about. They have to think about hundreds of different APIs.
Right, of course, which makes there's even more of an importance on standardizing those interactions to make it less of a friction moving between all the different APIs.
Yeah.
Kind of on that point, could any of you offer any insights on best practices for API versioning? The consistent topic, a lot of discussion on, and could inspire some debates at some times.
I'd have some perspective from Zapier. I think they would deal with it a lot before I go.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, we did a blog post about, or actually a couple of blog posts last year about how to deprecate an old API. We made some suggestions on sending a specific header with deprecation dates and info, because so we have some APIs at Zapier that we implemented ourselves. And there's also developers that integrate APIs into Zapier that are not actually directly affiliated with the company. So they don't have like the internal knowledge on any changes on that API. So those developers in particular run into issues where all of a sudden an endpoint doesn't work anymore, or it changes, or the API version stops. And the whole benefit of being able to create a workflow or to create an integration or whatever way you use an API, and then believe it, it works. That also means that, I mean, and why would I check the website for an API once a week to check if there's any news? I need to be informed if there's any news. And one way can be if I register for a client ID in secret, that I give my email address and I get email notifications on important changes. Another is to hopefully come to a standard of headers that will be sent in response that you can then listen for. And then when you get notified in those response headers about deprecations and changes, you can trigger on that and do whatever you want with that. So we made some suggestions on that part.
Cool. Yeah, we'll try and link to that in the comment field later. But in general, I'm just laughing because Patrice Krakow says don't in capital letters. I've seen that philosophy across the web pretty often as well. But if you are, it seems like the best practice is just to make sure that all of this is very lucidly communicated to your audience. So,
yeah, I guess designing for change, from the get-go is also something that people should consider. This is something, interestingly, we see a parallel with this notion of changing UIs for people, right? Like you don't immediately go and check, shuffle the interface around for people. Like every time we have done that in Postman, if you have moved even a single button, people like, you just broke my workflow, right? And the same thing applies to APIs, right? Like you move something from one place to another, and sometimes there are good reasons for doing that. But like the core problem is, like, I think I would look at like the API client spread of your application. One thing is, if an API is out there and people are using it and you don't have control over the clients, that's where like don't applies. But if you do have control over the clients in some form, which is, it goes from having control inside a company to having a partner ecosystem and then third-party developers, there are different rules that apply. So,
you can have some pretty dramatic continuous versioning practices within an internal API ecosystem. If everyone's on board, everyone's communicating. I guess it depends on the size of the corporation as well.
Oh, yeah. So if you picture it, the more like in an internal organization, you have direct lines of communication. But if you can establish the same with your external developers, you might have the same. You might be more. Your API might be more adaptable to change, right? And people don't do that part. They expect like, okay, developers to kind of take the heavy burden, which of course, pisses everyone off.
Exactly.
So one change we deal with quite often is a change of authentication method. So, for example, an API moving from OAuth 1 to 2. And then for us, it's important that users don't have if they all need to reconnect their account to Zapier and see their workflows break and stuff like that. That's not something we want. And if we know we have enough time before they switch authentication, we've seen that most companies are pretty open to having some kind of a migration path there where we can hit like a specific endpoint to swap an OAuth 1 secret for an OAuth 2 one. And just in the end, I mean, your two APIs talking together, or your software and APIs talking together, you want to make sure that whatever issues there are, they can be dealt with between those APIs and software and not by the user. That's always the most important principle to follow whatever change you make to an API, be it versioning or authentication.
Right. It should never be affecting the user.
Oh.
And if even with like error responses, like you're just saying, having the HTTP status code, but along with the metadata, the human readable codes that make sure the app developer and even perhaps know what's going on. I think we've covered this before so far, but are there any other points any of you would like to discuss in terms of best strategies for producing quality external documentation? I think Pierre is asking, he wants to know, can automation be used, or should these resources be handcrafted? Because we're seeing a lot of documentation coming onto the space. So is this viable going forward? And if so, do you have any favorites that you'd like to mention?
So I'm biased there, of course. So kind of comes in with my recommendation. One of the things that we saw at least was that good external documentation is a very clear reflection of your internal development practices. Kind of goes without saying. People, like, if you don't have your internal APIs documented well, you can't even start with your external API documentation. And there are always places where people kind of create this layer outside, and then they're like, which service does it talk to, how does it get handled, etc. So we focused kind of Postman's efforts on kind of connecting these two sides together, right? Like, so you can use Postman for internal documentation, you can use Postman for external documentation. And with respect to kind of automation, there are things on the tooling side that can be automated, but I think like you have to maybe that there is a role for like a product manager here, a dedicated API product manager, to look at all the use cases that your developers have. I think this part, which is just the more kind of human and people part of it, is something I would highly recommend everybody to invest time in. Go and talk to developers, find their use cases, and then bring that knowledge in, so it kind of becomes a shared resource for everybody else. And there are some tools in Postman to help you do even that. Those were the workflows and the test scripting part that I think we've been building for a while. So I would recommend that. I think knowing that external documentation is just much more comprehensive, has to be much more comprehensive, is a good start. And just throwing like a reference documentation in the form of like, hey, these are all the 300 endpoints that we have, is not enough. It's people learn APIs like the way they learn a new programming language. They need to understand the semantics, what are the objects in there, and you have to look at it as if they're learning kind of bit by bit by bit. So some dedicated effort is I think I would very strongly recommend that.
Fokke, care to weigh in on that debate?
Fully
generation versus handcrafted?
there. Yeah. Definitely, there's a lot of repeated stuff that you don't want to do manually, so you want to generate it. But mostly, the combination of having reference with like tutorials or a more task-based is what I prefer personally as a developer.
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to, just making it consumable, thinking from the developer standpoint, and really thinking about their experience in, like you say, Abhinav, learning a new programming language in a way. It's what the API experience is like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, I think we're a little over time now, so I think that's going to be it. I'm just going to finish with some closing statements. So let me bring up the screen share again. There we go. So thanks for tuning in to our second live cast. We're going to be doing a lot more of these. Thank you to our sponsor, Curity.io, identity management server. And if you're interested in what we're discussing, follow us at Nordic APIs on Twitter, or join our Slack group as well. We're trying to continue the conversation going on there. If you or your company is interested in participating in our next live cast, we'd love to have you. Contact us at that email right there. And like I said before, stay tuned for more events from Nordic APIs, more live casts. We're trying to bring in core community members to talk about these really specific subjects. And I want to dig even deeper next time, take even more questions from the community. It's really fun to answer them in a live setting like this. This video should be posted to YouTube immediately, and we'll try to include any links other resources that we mentioned throughout. So once again, thank you to our speakers, Abhinav and Fokke, for joining us today. And I'm going to sign off. Yeah, it's been really great. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. It's great great being here.
Awesome. All right, hope to see you at an event sometime. Bye.
Yep, bye.